Hey Ken, this is Greg. It is Tuesday, February the 8th, year 2022. I had a good day in class today. We covered two chapters. That was 20 and 21, I think is what we covered. 20 and 20, yes, chapters 20 and 21. And my kids were really into these chapters today. The chapter 20 starts out with Dolphus Raymond. Scout had taken Dill outside because Dill was upset because of Mr. Gilmer's cross-examining of Tom Robinson, and he just got upset and he was crying, and so she was forced to take him out. And there they met Mr. Dolphus Raymond. I told you my kids really got into this. The second part of this chapter has to deal with Atticus's summation to the jury. And they were very much into this. If you've ever watched the movie, I'm sure you have, you watched the movie To Kill a Mockingbird, it's one of the best scenes of the entire movie. His obviously heartfelt appeal to the jury to acquit Tom Robinson. And it's a very powerful part. And then the second chapter, they were both pretty short chapters, then the second chapter, we got the verdict returned by the jury. So I want to talk to you about those two things here. I found this chapter 20, this Dolphus Raymond. I've never spent much time on this chapter at all, but we spent a considerable amount of time on it today. My kids just kept on coming up with new things, and like I've told you before, I mean, I learn from my kids. I learn new things every year, and I incorporate things that I've learned from past classes into my teachings, and plus the stuff that I know as well. But the first thing that came up was Dolphus Raymond offered Dill a drink out of his brown bag, and the belief around town is that Dolphus Raymond is nothing but an alcoholic who he has mixed children, part black, part white. And he's just viewed as, he's accepted in the town. I talked to my kids about this, and I may have mentioned it in talking with you on this as well. He's accepted in the town because his family has lived there a long time, and he has property. He has a lot of property all along the riverbank. So even though people don't necessarily accept him, he's not like the Ewells. He's higher class than Bob Ewell and family. But people seldom have anything to say to him. And he's not in town all that often anyway. He's chosen the life that he wants to live. And he makes some pretty astute statements in here when he's talking to Dill. I got it here in the book. And I'm going to read for a little while out of this. We get to the part where Dill is offered a drink by Dolphus Raymond, and Scout's all up in arms because she thinks it's whiskey. Dill takes a sip, and it's Coca-Cola. Right? Scout, it's nothing but Coca-Cola. Mr. Raymond sat up against the tree trunk. He had been lying on the grass. You little folks won't tell me now, will you? It'd ruin my reputation if you did. You mean all you drink in that sack's Coca-Cola, just plain Coca-Cola? Yes, ma'am. Mr. Raymond nodded. I liked his smell. It was of leather, horses, cottonseed. He wore the only English riding boots I had ever seen. That's all I drink most of the time, he said. Then you just pretend you're half... I beg your pardon, sir. I caught myself. I didn't mean to be. Mr. Raymond chuckled, not at all offended, and I tried to frame a discreet question. Why do you do like you do? Why, oh yes, you mean why do I pretend? Well, it's very simple, he said. Some folks don't like the way I live. Now, I could say to hell with them, but I don't care if they don't like it. I do say I don't care if they don't like it right enough, but I don't say the hell with them. See? I said no, a little convoluted logic there. But here's what I want you to see. I try to give them a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. When I come to town, which is seldom, if I weave a little and drink out of the sack, folks can say Dolphus Raymond's in the clutches of whiskey. That's why he won't change his way. He can't help himself. That's why he lives the way he does. All right, and I took a good long while in this last paragraph that I read you here. I try to give them a reason, you see. I kind of belabored this point, and my kids got it. They picked it up. They picked it up really well. And I told them, I said, try to frame this, what he's saying here. I try to give them a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. And I prompted the kids, I said, I want you to try to frame this into what's going on, the trial, and Tom Robinson. What he's saying there, he's not just speaking about himself. He's speaking more on an adult level, knowing that the kids are probably not going to understand it. But at someday, they will figure it out themselves. And so my kids kind of jumped on. I had to prompt them a little bit more. And I said, look, as far as Macomb goes and this trial goes, look what he said again. I try to give him a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. The people in town and the people on the jury and the people in the courtroom, they already made up their mind about Tom Robinson before he came to trial. As soon as they heard about the charge brought by Bob Ewell, they had made up their mind. And I pointed out yesterday how Mr. Gilmer kept on berating Tom Robinson on the witness stand, kept on calling him boy and boy, and called him Robinson, didn't call him Tom Robinson. He called him Robinson, in just a disrespectful manner, disrespectful tone, and then continuing to call him boy. And I pointed out yesterday to my kids in class, I'm pretty sure I did on the video as well, he just wasn't being racially motivated here, although he was. He wanted to get the conviction. But he was being opportunistic here. He was giving the jury a reason to, just like he said, just like Adolphus Raymond said here, it helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. And he was giving the jury a reason to convince themselves that they ought to find Tom Robinson guilty. And that is really, great. This is a treasure chest of this paragraph. I try to give them a reason, you see. It helps folks if they can latch onto a reason. And that's exactly what had happened in Macomb. That's exactly what's happening in this trial. All that people needed was a reason to back up their beliefs. I've got written on the board here, people have already made up their minds without listening to any other point of view cannot be changed. If you remember from earlier in the book, Atticus was talking to Jim and to Scout. And, he said, I'm just concerned, I'm concerned that Jim and Scout, or he was talking about them, not to them, I think he was talking to Alexandra. He said, I don't want them to catch Macomb's usual disease, which of course was racism. And the people in town all they needed was the slightest of reasons to validate what they believe in. They weren't going to change if you gave him any reason at all. So therefore, Mr. Gilmer, he kept on referring to Tom as boy. Boy, he was reminding the jury, not that they needed any more reminders, but he was ramping up all the encouragement he could muster in giving them a reason to find Tom Robinson guilty. And the only reason they needed was that Tom Robinson was a black man and his word was going against two white people's reasons. We discussed in class, and this is pretty amazing, that my kids came up with this concept. I wasn't going to bring it up. I hadn't even thought of it, although I knew what it was. In fact, I just watched a video about it last week. But one of my students in my class, it was a young girl, she's the only black student I have in class. Well, I don't know, I may have two. All right, anyway, she said, we talked about it in our, in another class last week, publications. She said, we talked about this thing called confirmation bias. Is that what you're talking about? I thought, man, that is good. Ding, 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 ring the bell. All right, obviously, it's confirmation bias. All right, and what confirmation bias, you probably already know, is giving people something to validate what they already believe. Something to validate what they've already settled in their minds, what they believe. The particular video that I watched last week had to deal with church doctrine and things that people believe and things that are not scriptural, but they believe anyway, and because it's their particular brand of beliefs. But you can't necessarily find it as a doctrine, prescribed by the Bible, or proscribed by the Bible. And that's what the video was about, is about confirmation bias. All that people need to continue their beliefs. You think of cults. Why is it so hard for people to escape from a cult? It's because they have their sets of values and beliefs already cemented into their system, and all that they need is someone, a leader or somebody, to tell them, well, the world's out to get you, the government's out to get you, or whatever, the Baptists are out to get you, or the Methodists are out to get you, whatever. That's all that they need, to feel a little martyrdom or whatever, and it validates their belief systems, even though their belief systems are not necessarily based upon Scripture. So anyway, I thought that was really good that this girl came up with this idea that Mr. Dolphus Raymond was talking about here. And again, he was talking on an adult level with these kids. The next lesson that could be learned from talking to Dolphus Raymond was his view of Atticus Finch. And this is just the next page from where I was. A scout says, Atticus says cheating a colored man is 10 times worse than cheating a white man, I muttered. Says it's the worst thing you can do. So we had to pause at that paragraph as well and talk to my kids. I said, well, what does he mean by that statement? Cheating a colored man is 10 times worse than cheating a white man. And, the answer, of course, is, blacks had been, had been sent to the lowest levels of society, not even considered by most people in the South at that time, not even considered to be human beings. And Atticus is going to get to that here later in his summation speech as well. And, and so black, in this world, in this society, blacks had everything going against them to begin with. They were generally poor. They generally had the worst jobs in a community. They had very little chance of advancement, and if they, at any time in their lives, if they were caught up in a dispute with a white man, they were going to lose. So they were hanging very tenderly just on keeping a daily life. And Atticus says it's 10 times worse. So I'm assuming he thinks that the whites in their society had at least 10 times as much going for them as the blacks did. I almost shared a scriptural passage with him, but I couldn't, just because of the way. If kids bring up something with the Bible, I can talk freely about it, but I can't just off the top of my head unless it's literature related, directly related to literature. I can't bring things up. But I immediately thought of the story of David and Bathsheba, and how Nathan the prophet came to David, and he told him a story about a man who had one sheep, and somebody needed a sheep to prepare for dinner, the king or whoever it was, or a ruler or whatever, and he took the poor man's sheep, and Nathan confronted David and said, "You're that man." And this is kind of what I thought here. The blacks had so little, and especially in this case of Tom Robinson, what little he has is being taken from him, his freedom, and eventually his life. If he's convicted, he's going to be executed. And that's exactly what it reminded me of. But then Dolphus Raymond goes on. Mr. Raymond said, "I don't reckon it's Miss Jean Louise. You don't know your pa's not a run-of-the-mill man. It'll take a few years for that to sink in. You haven't seen enough of the world yet." And I understand perfectly, Scout and Jim only know Atticus as Atticus because, as we've been told by Miss Maudie earlier in the book, the way Atticus is at home is exactly the way he is out in public. There's no difference, and Jim told that to Dill here. She said the way Atticus is in court is the way he always is. And Jim and Scout, they don't have a good view, a good perspective of nearly everybody else in the world. Atticus is such a unique individual in the society. His, his thoughts are, I had one student tell me today, said his thoughts are progressive. I said, well, I guess in today's terminology, yeah, they would be kind of progressive, but that's not the term they would use then, I don't think, anyway. But, Atticus thought differently about social things than the rest of, nearly the rest of the town did. I think we're getting an indication that some people are trying to come around to Atticus's point of view. They're slowly getting there, like the men who came to visit, the night before Tom Robinson was brought back to jail. But he points out that, Dolphus points out the uniqueness of Atticus Finch. At 230 is my page number, so I wouldn't forget it. And again, Jim and Scout, they just think everybody's like their daddy. And they're not going to escape that thinking until they get out in other, among other people when they're older. One of the biggest blessings of my lifetime, three of my children went away to school, not all at the same time, but when they went away to school, they came home, and all three of them have told us individual times, we didn't realize how you and Mom were. You're different than everybody else, and we're not different than everybody else. We're just different from a lot of people in the world today. They said our family life is different than everybody else's that I'm at school with, and I realize now what a good thing it was, and they thanked us for it. And I think that's going to be the same revelation that Scout is going to get when she gets older. That her daddy was rather unique, way ahead of his time, and his thought processes, and in his wisdom. He knew what he could do, and he knew what he couldn't do. And like said much earlier, Atticus knew from the very beginning this was a lost cause. This trial for Tom Robinson here in Macomb, he really had no chance whatsoever. This chapter, I told you, this chapter seems just kind of out of place, at least the first part of it anyway. And it reminded me of the chapter with Mrs. Henry Lafayette Dubose, which, as I pointed out earlier, was just the exclamation mark to the theme of the first 11 chapters of the book about understanding people and putting yourself in their skin, walking around in their shoes, and so on. But Atticus is, like I said, Scout and Jim both, they're going to get an understanding of really just how excellent a person their dad is. They don't realize it now because they see him every day, and I'm assuming they think that's just the way everybody is, at least parents. All right, so then we go to the next part of this chapter, Atticus' summation to the jury. This is one of the best scenes in the movie. I think I've already mentioned that. But every time I show it, the whole room is just dead quiet. And it was dead quiet today as I was reading this out loud to them as well. Some of the things the points that he makes are just, they're blunt. Some of them are rather subtle. But, he's getting to the point. He points out who the problem is. Gentlemen, I shall be brief, but I would like to use my remaining time with you to remind you that this case is not a difficult one. Even farmers like you. It requires no minute sifting of complicated facts, but it does require you to be sure beyond all reasonable doubt as to the guilt of the defendant. To begin with, this case should never have come to trial. This case is as simple as black and white. Nice double play on words there. The state has not produced one iota of medical evidence. Remember what Atticus asked Hecate, and he asked Bob Ewell, did you run for a doctor that night? And of course, if they would have gotten a doctor, they could have told she had not been raped, and that would have been the end of that. All right, it had to concoct another story, but it probably wouldn't have involved Tom Robinson, although they may have accused him of beating Mayella up. But they added the rape in, so they couldn't get out of that. The state has not produced one iota of medical evidence to the effect that the crime Tom Robinson is charged with ever took place. It has relied instead upon the testimony of two witnesses whose evidence has not only been called into serious question on cross-examination, but has been flatly contradicted by the defendant. The defendant is not guilty, but somebody in this courtroom is, and everybody who's there know who he's talking about, Bob Ewell. There's not a doubt in anybody's mind. In most of the people's mind, they know that Bob Ewell did beat her up. Okay? I have nothing but pity in my heart for the chief witness for the state, but my pity does not extend so far as to her putting a man's life at stake, which she has done in an effort to get rid of her own guilt. I say, gentlemen, because it was guilt that motivated her. She has committed no crime. She has merely broken a rigid and time-honored code of our society, a code so severe that whoever breaks it is hounded from our midst as unfit to live with. Once again, I bring up to, not that you need it, I bring up to you the social structure of the South at that time. Again, white people were not allowed to cross this imaginary line to be with blacks or to equate with blacks or let blacks equate to them, nor were black people allowed to go to cross that imaginary line to basically to claim equality with white people. And the only exception to that was Dolphus Raymond, of course. So what Atticus said is, Mayella Ewell, she broke that time-honored code, that irresistible code, and it came crashing down upon her. She hugged a black man. She kissed a black man. And that was an unacceptable piece of behavior for any white woman, in that society then. And what did he say was going to happen to her if that got found out? A code so severe that whoever breaks it, this is what was facing Mayella when she got caught, that whoever breaks it is hounded from our midst as unfit to live with. She is the victim of cruel poverty and ignorance, but I cannot pity her. She is white. She knew full well the enormity of her offense, but because her desires were stronger than the code she was breaking, she persisted in breaking it. She persisted, and her subsequent reaction is something that all of us have known at one time or another. She did something every child has done. She tried to put the evidence of her offense away from her, but in this case, she was no child hiding stolen contraband. She struck out at her victim. Of necessity, she must put him away from her. He must be removed from her presence from this world. She must destroy the evidence of her offense. And he goes on, and he keeps on talking. And I skipped over a part that I wanted to get to before he got into this. Go back a page, and there's something I want you to see. We talked about it here in class today. Atticus did something before he started making the summation speech. Atticus paused, then he did something he didn't ordinarily do. He unhitched his watch and chain and placed them on the table, saying, with the court's permission. Judge Taylor nodded, and then Atticus did something I never saw him do before or since, in public or in private. He unbuttoned his vest, unbuttoned his collar, loosened his tie, and took off his coat. He never loosened a scrap of his clothing, even when he got home, until he undressed at bedtime. And to Jim and me, seeing him take off his jacket and vest and everything here in court, this was the equivalent of him standing before us stark naked. Atticus put his hands in his pockets, and as he returned to the jury, I saw his gold collar button and the tips of his pen and pencil winking in the light. And then he started making his summation. All right, got talking with the students today, and I asked them, I just said, this is a brand new one for me, by the way, as well. I just picked it up as we were reading today. Why did Atticus do this? What was his purpose for taking off his jacket, his vest, undoing his shirt, taking off his tie, taking out his pocket watch and chain? He had a purpose in mind for doing it. This was just not some random thought. He wasn't getting so hot that he was just uncomfortable. No. He was in Atticus's own way, he was getting down to the level of the jurors. The jurors were all farmers. And Atticus standing there in a coat and jacket and tie and everything might have been a little imposing upon those poor farmers. who I'm sure, at least in the movie, they were all wearing overalls. So Atticus put himself out for one time in his life, and for lack of a better term, he humbled himself. He did something he wouldn't normally do. He wasn't at ease with, and he took off, you know, these amount of clothing, and then he went back to the jurors. And basically what he was saying is, here is one man just like you. I've come to talk to you man to man. I'm no different than you are. Continue what Scout has to say. Gentlemen, he said, and Jim and I looked at each other. Atticus could have easily just said, Scout, you know, like when he's getting ready to talk to them. His voice had lost its aridity, its detachment, and he was talking, that's what I want you to see here, he was talking to the jury as if they were folks on the post office corner. So again, he did this thing here, you know, he took off his clothes, part of his clothes, something he was totally unused to doing. And he tried to put himself down on the level with all these jurors who were just simply, you know, poor, largely ignorant farmers. All right? And then, of course, at the end of the chapter, Calpurnia shows up, and the kids, they know they're in trouble. Atticus had given strict orders that they were not to come down to the courthouse. And, of course, they snuck down after lunch. And then chapter 21, it's the verdict. And this is a moving chapter as well to my kids, and it is in the movie as well. I remember the first couple times, especially the first time I read the book, I wanted to scream out, how can you bring back a verdict of guilty? But of course it was unanimous, had to be unanimous. They were out a long time, so obviously they were debating. They were having some issues. I imagine most court cases that involved a black man, the jury probably deliberated between 5 and 15 minutes, half an hour at the most, just to make it respectable. But in this case, I did the math. They were gone for 4 hours, and they were deliberating. But eventually they got to the unanimous verdict of guilty. And you think about this again. It's the first time before I really understood the depthness of this book. I just wanted to yell out, "How could you find him guilty?" The evidence points to the fact that he is obviously innocent, and that Bob Ewell is the one who beat up his daughter. There was no rape involved. He just beat her up. And you know, as I've gone through this, teaching this over the years, you know, when I get to the social structure of the South, and I began to realize, oh, this is why they had to find him guilty. They could not, and it's what Atticus said, that, you know, we're not going to win. He said that early, even before they went to trial. And, you know, the answer for that is now obvious. The men could not have found Tom Robinson. They could not have acquitted him, couldn't have found him not guilty. If they did, they would have granted equality to a black man with the whites. They would have taken the word, and Atticus even mentioned this in his summary. You got the assumption by the jury and by everybody involved is the word of a black man will never be taken over the word of a white person. And he said in this case there's 2 white witnesses. But as you understand, what's at stake for the jury and for the white people in town? What's at stake is they're losing their place of dominance in the society. Again, one of the first lessons I told you about the relationships in this story, the first one, this is a political book. It's about who has power in this story and who does not have power. And in this story, the whites have all the power, the blacks have none. And this is just, again, this is another exclamation mark, if you want to put it that way, to the fact that a black man was not going to ever be taken at his word. He was always going to be found guilty when it came to confronting whites. And to do so would have made it, to acquit him, to find him not guilty, at least in the whites' minds, would mean a drastic change in their society. Because if one black person gets the idea that they are now equals with a white, then they'll all, want equality with the whites, and it would change their society forever. So, Anyway, that's all I've got today. These were two really good chapters for my kids. I'll be back tomorrow with another chapter, and hope your day tomorrow is better than today. See you, Kim.